Now, I've told you about some ideas which are relevant, and I'm about to do a sort of synthesis of them to sum up. But before I do that, I just want to make one or two comments about some life forms which are difficult to know whether they're alive or not alive. Of course, there's no simple answers here, but viruses are the critical one. This is a bacteriophage, which is a virus that lives inside bacteria, but we have viruses in us as well. Now, viruses have a nucleic acid genome. It can be based on DNA or RNA, both work, and they contain, that genome, genes encoding components of the virus. They undergo evolution by natural selection. We see that with, for example, how the flu virus changes all the time, every generation. So they're undergoing evolution by natural selection, which you could argue is a very important principle for defining life. It was one that was actually proposed by Hermann Müller. He was a geneticist in the mid-20th century, because he defined life as living things have properties which allow them to undergo natural selection and therefore to evolve. He simply took Darwin's idea and turned it into a sort of a principle. Oh, I should have said, Darwin wasn't the first person to think of natural selection. Should have said that. It was published in 1831 by a man called Matthews, who was writing a book about ship's timbers and how to grow it. It was only one side, so it was nothing like Darwin, but he did have the principle. And he wrote to Darwin after Origin of Species and said, you might be interested in reading this. And Darwin, in the second edition, actually acknowledged this. And of course, the story of him also, Alfred Wallace, who had the same idea when in a malarial fever, is well known. Back to viruses. Viruses evolve by natural selection, so they pass, if you like, the Müller test. But they can only reproduce themselves when they're inside the cells of other living things. They're completely dependent upon it. And they do so by hijacking the cell's molecular machinery to copy the virus's genome and to make the components that encase that virus. So this means a virus cannot operate separately from another living being, its host. It's completely dependent upon another living entity. So is it truly alive or isn't it? Well, there's no clear answer about this, but I want to say something that generally isn't discussed in thinking about this. It's important to remember that other life forms are also, to greater or lesser extent, often dependent on other living things. It's not just viruses that have such a dependency. We have many parasites that live inside the cells of bodies or animals or plants or fungi, which are living and depending upon them. This dependency is less total than it is for a virus, but it's in the same direction. Even our cells, we cannot make all the chemicals we need. We get them from some other living organisms. We can't make certain amino acids efficiently. We have to eat them, and we eat them from plants and animals that actually do make them. So we are also not entirely independent of other living organisms. Even free-living microbes are dependent on molecules made by other living organisms. Bacteria, fungi, and so on require glucose, ammonia, generally made from other living organisms, particularly plants, which use the energy of the sun to make biomolecules from simple chemicals, including from the carbon dioxide in the air or nitrogen, which is in turn actually made by bacteria found in the roots of certain plants. What I'm trying to stress here, and as I said, it's not normally sort of recognized, what we really have is a graded spectrum of living organisms, from viruses, which are obviously utterly dependent, through to plants, which are almost completely independent and a wide range in form. In the case of the virus, the dependency is strong. In other, it's weak. But They all share attributes of life, and where you want to draw the line is up to you. And it depends really on your psychology. Are you in your taxonomy? Do you like splitting things up, or do you like putting them together? I like putting them together and saying they're all life, but some require other life forms to fully operate. But actually, all life on the earth is fundamentally connected. It's also fundamentally related as a result of evolution. There is a great interdependency of all living forms on our planet. Now, I'm going to finish with principles. And I'm going to describe 6 principles which I think are important for thinking about life. The first one is simply really a description. I've discussed all of these things before. It's just really to try and put it together. Living organisms have these properties. They maintain themselves, they grow, they can organize themselves, they are exquisite at doing that, self-organization. They can reproduce, make precise copies of themselves, they have heredity, and they're highly diverse. This is what we have to explain. These are the attributes of life. Secondly, life, and this is critical, this is the Muller statement. Life evolves by natural selection through reproduction, heredity, and the variability of the heredity system. Now, by doing this, they acquire purpose. They are entities that can build and maintain themselves, and they have these attributes that allows them to actually do that, and therefore to evolve. But it's the way purposeful behavior can arise without having to invoke a creator. So it's critical. The third one, the cell is the basic unit of life, separate from the environment, but in communication with the environment. This is clearly required to cope with the second law of thermodynamics, and you have a bounded entity that can make a complex entity to produce the things that you see on that slide. Principle 4. Life is based on carbon polymer chemistry. We have lipid membranes built on carbon that separates the cells. Hereditary material built on carbon polymers that makes DNA, makes RNA. We have enzymes built on protein carbon polymers, which easily give rise to chemical reactions. So polymer chemistry can give rise to complex chemical reactions, whilst nucleic acids store information in linear chains of DNA bases. Integrating all these functions together is needed, and what a living organism does is to gather informational inputs from within itself and from outside itself, processes them, stores them, uses it to instruct the cells to behave in particular ways. All of this is generated by polymer chemistry. And I don't need to repeat it, but the beauty of it, the stable chemical structure of nucleic acid, chemically inactive, beautiful for storing information, so easily translated into the chemically reactive proteins that we see there in living things. Final point, life is related and to everything else on the planet, and it's highly interconnected, and we are dependent to varying extents upon all other life forms on the planet. We are all part of an ecosystem. I didn't put it up here, but just to stress, all life has to use energy to organize itself. That energy ultimately comes mostly from the sun through light and photosynthesis, generating high energy compounds, but it can also come from heat, from geothermal sources where there's life forms that depend upon that. So this is what I want you to think about in principles underlying life. But I want to end with something a little bit more almost philosophical. I think the principles we've talked about here are likely to be found in other life forms, should they exist, on in somewhere else in the universe. I think in particularly important is polymers because of the way it connects information to chemical reactions. And I think that's something that is really quite profound if you think about it. But if we consider our planet, it is, of course, the only corner of the universe where we know for certain, at the moment at least, that life exists. And we know, as I started, that it is extraordinary. It's extraordinarily diverse, and we can make sense of it. And making sense of it, by the way, is fun. It's rather central to our culture and our civilization. I mean, we have to know it. I mean, it's important to us. We know that we're related to the rest of life on the planet. We also know we're deeply connected to the rest of life on the planet. As far as we are aware, we are the only life forms on this planet who can see this deep connectivity and reflect on what it means. I would also argue we have a particular responsibility, because of all of this, for life on this planet. It's made up of our relatives, some of them quite distant, but they are all, in some sense, our relatives. And we are interconnected with it. I want to leave you with this thought. We need to care about life. We need to care about it, and we need to care for it. And to do that, we need to understand it. And I hope you understand it a bit better at the end of this talk than at the beginning. Thank you very much.